Now the Stephen A. Schwarzman Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. To join us from Berlin, Mr. Ian Johnson.
Hi, well, thank you for the nice, very warm introduction. And it's great to be at the conference again, although unfortunately, unlike previous times, I'm not able to be there in person. The past year and a half has been quite tumultuous for me. I had to leave China, and so my update that Chun-Xin was mentioning is maybe more of a reflection looking back, rather than say the latest news from on the ground in China, because I haven't been in China in over a year. I guess that's true for a lot of people nowadays because of the COVID situation. It's hard to get back. I was in China as a journalist and had to leave in March of last year because of the tensions between the Trump administration and Beijing and the government. So I think I will probably be back in China in the future. As Chun-Xin said, I'm now working at the Council on Foreign Relations, writing a book, and on history in China, on unofficial histories in China, and I'm still following China. As you can see, I'm wearing a Chinese. So I try to have this Zhongxi, this China Western Jiehe, this sort of fusion thing here. I guess I don't look very Chinese, so at least I wear a Chinese shirt. But anyways, I guess my lame effort there. Okay, everybody can see that okay? A picture that I took in a cave, in a shrine in Fujian province, and I'm going to get back to this picture toward the end of my talk. But as you can see, I climbed up a rock to get a picture from behind Mary looking down on the worshippers. And I'll explain why I took that picture and also what you can see from here toward the end of my talk. I wanted to talk a little bit about, in previous talks, I've emphasized the religious revival in China, and that's something that one shouldn't underestimate. But I thought it was also worth, now I'm going to be focusing more, say, on the current policies under the Xi administration. And I thought it was important to keep in mind maybe some of the reasons for this return of religion that took place starting in the late 70s, 80s, and then sort of built steam in the 90s and 2000s, in which many of you who have been to China, and I know that you're all involved in China in some way, so I don't need to sort of preach to the choir here, but I think that it's worth looking maybe from the government's perspective of why it even allowed religion to return. Because this is something that isn't necessarily a given. I mean, maybe we think that religion is an unstoppable force among humans, which is probably true. But the governments have been successful in damping it down and keeping it, stomping on it. So why did religion come back? And I think one of the things you have to remember is when Mao died in 76 and Deng Xiaoping took over in 78, China was really a kind of broken country. There was still endemic poverty. It would take another decade of economic growth for China to crawl back out of the poverty trap that had been created by many of the Mao policies. This is a picture of Beijing in front of the diplomatic compound around the time they were created, I think in the late 1970s. Of course, there's no automobile traffic. China, it wasn't, it had a very functioning government that was different, but its people were very poor and had just been through traumatic, a series of sort of almost 30 years of traumatic political campaigns, such as the Cultural Revolution, which this picture is taken from, of a member of the party, a very loyal member, the son of an important party member who is being tortured and will later be executed. And so the party was imploding because of its own policies. It was a wreck compared to where it had been in 1949. And of course, it attacked religion and destroyed so much of the religious infrastructure in China. So when Deng took power, the Communist Party needed to make a new pact with society and needed to allow a return of religion. So this was, in essence, the government operating from a position of weakness. It wasn't that the government had had a sort of, enlightenment and decided to become super tolerant and wise and so on and so forth. It had to do this to win back over elements of society that had been completely alienated over the previous 30 years. So from the government's point of view, of course, it needed to do this. It was a political decision. And you can see this in the documents that the party released in the 1980s, that this was seen as a tactical move, not that it wanted religion to come back and play an important role in society, but because it felt it had to. So what happened next, I think, was surprising. It was more than just a little bit of religion coming back for old people, which is, I think, largely how the party saw it. Maybe people who had been born before 1949 who still had some religious affinity. There were young people who were going worshiping, and religious life exploded and became part of the fabric of the People's Republic in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. And I think this kind of shocked the party. Don't forget, the party had a lot of battles to fight in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. It was trying to get the economy running. It was trying to, after Tiananmen, it was trying to get out from the threat of sanctions that were always hanging over its head in the 1990s, trying to join the World Trade Organization. And then you had a fairly laissez-faire government from about 2002 to 2012 under Hu Jintao, that allowed more civil society to take root. But I don't think that this was necessarily something that all people in the party thought was a good idea. And indeed, so I think this is and I think it's also important. This is part of a broader social awakening. We had, starting in the 1980s, if you were in China in the 1980s, these kind of pictures are kind of common, perhaps, of people selling stuff on the street corners and turning it into sort of free market things, the return of clan, lineage societies. This is a sort of a funny picture I took at a god of wealth giant temple complex outside of Xi'an, but they call it the Mammon culture area, which has sort of biblical take to the. Somebody must have just used, the dictionary, and Saishan came out as Mammon or something. But anyways, in any case, but this was sort of a part of a broader explosion of civil society that went on, and that I think left the party somewhat unhappy. And so people like this, large influencers in social media, for example, were brought to heel. This is before Xi Jinping. This is after the Beijing Olympics, around 2010, 2011. The government kind of kneecapped the most popular social media site, Weibo, which is similar to Twitter, right? In the sense that you can just follow anybody you want. They don't have to agree to allow you to follow them. And this allowed people to have massive multi-million followers, and to create people who were sort of social influencers, who were quite influential, who were outside the government control, the party's control. And so the government then moved against them. This is still already, this is under Hu Jintao, before we even get to Xi Jinping. So you have to, I think, understand that to see where government policy is coming from. It isn't something that just sort of started in 2012 when Xi took power. It's part of, I think, the party trying to reassert control over society. It had this, what it felt was probably a necessary, if perhaps unwanted, retreat in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, or unwanted by at least some elements of the party, and then a reassertion of control. And so when Xi takes control in 2012, he wants to reassert ideological control over China and not allow this kind of free-for-all that had taken place, especially under Hu. I mean, Hu Jintao had ideology, had ideas, and tried to push um, some thoughts and so on, but did not do it in that forceful a way. He did not control as many levers of power that Xi Jinping had. I mean, Xi Jinping is the son of an important founding member of the Communist Party, just had so many more networks that he could operate, as opposed to Hu Jintao, who was a relatively weak leader. So Xi takes control and brings a Politburo to the National Museum of History and say, we are going to create the China Dream. This becomes a signature slogan, as everybody knows. And we're going to try to push for more control in ideology, which of course will then bleed over inevitably into religious life. Not just bleed over a little bit, but become part of that. So, but initially, you know, he wants to also show that he's sympathetic to traditional culture. Here he is visiting Chufu, the birthplace of Confucius, and he's looking at books on Confucius next to the party secretary from Chufu. It looks like he's about to have a heart attack. And this party secretary was later sacked for corruption, in fact, but maybe he realized his days were numbered when the big guy came to visit. He met overseas and domestic religious leaders, at least leaders of certain religions that he thought were helpful and useful, such as certain Buddhist organizations, such as this one here, Fo Guangshan, and its head, who is a Taiwanese abbot. And also the party pushed again, not quite as hard, but still pushed to keep the old party heroes, such as Lei Feng, alive. So this is, you know, Lei Feng is the selfless stainless steel, or what was it, rustless screw in the machine, who was always doing good because he loved the party, loved the people. Here he is polishing his truck, and coincidentally somebody's got a camera there and is taking a picture of him, which wasn't that common back in China back then. But anyways, not to say that it's all fake, but there was certainly these kinds of people were kind of, I don't want to say cast aside, but the party has always taught Lei Feng in school textbooks. But it's definitely true under Xi Jinping that there's an effort to reassert red heroes and red culture, red tourism, to push the party and its myths just as strongly as other things. And not to say that this is all sort of in the past or this belongs to the Mao era, but to make it clear that this is part of what the People's Republic is today. And I think we saw this very clearly last month when the party celebrated its 100th birthday. And there was, you know, a huge propaganda barrage of all the different heroes and all the different stories and myths around the party. And so I think they definitely want this to stay present in China today. These are bulletin boards, that show a little outlet, a little silhouette of Lei Feng up at the sort of top where he's wearing that kind of funny hat. So you have modern day Lei Fengs that are still celebrated in China. And the party has made an effort to burrow down into the recesses, the capillaries of civil society, and to try to co-opt groups like with awards and things like that. So here, this is just a local one in Beijing, on Beijing street corner. Let's see. Yeah, oops. Yeah, we can. This is a party campaign against cults, which also remains a priority for the party, that people, if they're going to follow religion, that they should follow the 5 established religions and not other groups. I think, and also very important for Xi, is to create a blending, a melding of communist and traditional culture, in a way that is perhaps more acceptable to people. So by taking sculptures like this from a traditional clay figurine factory near Tianjin and turning this into a nationwide campaign to support the China Dream. Little girl, at one point you could see blanketed around Chinese cities. And then also more recently, these kind of, if you look on the right-hand picture, promoting cultural confidence, and the idea that Chinese culture is just as good as any other culture, and as part of the Communist Party's role is to protect and preserve the good, elements of Chinese culture. And of course, how you then define what's the good element of Chinese culture is then a contentious issue, perhaps. And then the poster next to it, which is a little more at an angle, you see a little boy there, and he's learning songs, traditional Beijing folk songs, and repeating them, and so on and so forth. So this is in a subway station in Beijing. Yeah, and then these kind of posters now you are also quite common, using traditional ideas and slogans to promote government priorities, such as looking after the elderly. And this has an impact on religious life, because these ideas have a religious connotation, but the government, as I'll get to a little more explicitly in a few minutes, is promoting a certain kind of religious life, or a certain kind of philosophy, and not others, such as Wang Yangming, the Neo-Confucian scholar, who is reputed to be one of Xi Jinping's favorite philosophers. So he's a Ming Dynasty era Neo-Confucian scholar. One of his signature ideas is that people actually have a conscience and need to act on it, which is perhaps something that is a potentially dangerous idea for an authoritarian state to promote. But in any case, that's one of the philosophers who gets pushed quite a lot in China today. So I think religion may be, for the party, however, the thorniest problem. I think there are earlier efforts with the NGOs that were also cracked down. So before the new religious affairs regulations, there was an effort to rein in non-governmental organizations, everything from education to environment. And basically this was to ban foreign funding and ban or limit as much as possible foreign ties. So I see a direct parallel with religion. You had this almost as a template, a new NGO law that was passed in the 2010s, and then the effort to sort of enforce this. And this is, of course, if you're familiar with China, you know that this is how things work. These things are discussed. There are papers that are floated, laws passed, and then it's implemented. And these things all take time and it's spread out over a number of years. So just as with the NGO effort, the effort to deal with the religious problem, as the party probably sees it, as a too vibrant religious life, has played out over the past few years. Yeah, so banning foreign ties, and the goal of bringing religious organizations under government supervision in some way, and Sinicizing Chinese religions. I mean, I don't want to go too much into, I know there will be other panelists who will be talking specifically about Catholicism, but I will mention some of these things a little bit later. The government has less problem with some religious organizations, such as folk religious groups, such as this one here. In fact, some of them get government funding. If they need a place to meet and organize, they can get it. Often this is a group, for example, that has national level government support. It performs at temple fairs. It's sometimes just defined as folk culture. I mean, if you look at just this picture, you think it's a person performing something like martial arts or Peking opera or something like that. But it's actually a religious pilgrimage association. So they're put together to do pilgrimages to folk religious sites around China, such as one outside Beijing, Miaofengshan, and they do get government support. And these are often huge, enormous events that go on for 2 weeks and attract hundreds of thousands of people. Temples, if you've been to China in the past couple of decades, you'll probably notice that there's been an explosion of construction or expansion of temples, Taoist and Buddhist temples. As long as they're officially recognized and they're part of the Buddhist Association or the Taoist Association of China, they have been able to expand massively. If you go to for example, in Beijing, the White Cloud Temple, which is the headquarters of the Buddhist Association, the Taoist Association of China, so Baiyunguan, it has an enormous new complex for training Taoist priests. You could say indoctrinating them perhaps, but I think also in giving them a better education, making them more familiar with how the bureaucracy works, and so on and so forth. And so these are training camps, something like seminaries, and they come in there for workshops that can last from 2 months to a couple of years, depending on, and many people come back over time. And these kind of colleges are being built around the country. So this kind of construction is really, really common for, oh, wait a second. Oh, my orders, my slides. Well, I wanted to show you something else. Okay, never. Oh, looks like I got that out of line. Well, okay, it doesn't matter. Yeah, obviously other faiths, foreign faiths, which one could put in quotation marks, are seen as more problematic. And that means, of course, Christianity and Islam. I say you can put it in quotation marks because both religions have actually a very long history in China. I don't need to go into all that with you, but the government still views them as religions that have very strong overseas ties, which is accurate. And this is seen, just as with NGOs, a problem. So the goal that the government promotes for dealing with religions is to sinicize religions. Again, I would see this as part of a broader effort to rein in civil society, including NGOs, the internet, private enterprise. You've seen recently, for example, private enterprise. Many private entrepreneurs have been brought under the party's heel for being too independent. For Christianity, I think that the goal is very explicitly to reduce the role of house or underground churches, and different tactics for different faiths. For Catholicism, clearly the tactic is to use diplomacy to try to regain control. And with Protestantism, it's more like a warning shots across the bow to try to bring the churches to heel. The idea of sinicizing religions is perhaps bizarre to hear this coming from the party, because for many years the party did not want to sinicize, say, Christianity, wanted to keep it at arm's length, and there were efforts going back more than 100 years on the part of the church, for example, to sinicize. For example, here in Beijing, at the original buildings for Furen University, and even in artwork, to have sinicized Christian artwork. These things have a long history, and so on some level, you can say there's really no problem in sinicizing religion. All religions, anyway, when they move around the world, they tend to adapt. If they're going to survive in a local culture, they usually have to adapt to some degree, right? So on some level, this shouldn't be a problem. And here we have more modern efforts at combining Chinese and Western or Christianity. And here, for example, a marriage ceremony that I saw in Shanxi, which is a really great example of some sort of sinicization of Christian and and local practices. You have the bride and groom. You can see them in the foreground with their backs to us. And I think that's the bride's parents, could be the groom's parents. Anyways, they switched out. They're sitting down. Between them is a picture of Jesus, obviously. And they go, and then in traditional fashion, they'll go down and kowtow before the picture, but also to the parents, and ask to be, for each one to be admitted into the family in traditional form. So, I mean, I thought that that's a really great way to synthesize practices, but marriage or wedding practices. But this isn't necessarily, I don't think, what the government has in mind, these kinds of things. To put it crudely, I think the government's view is much more that it wants to have a clearer idea of what's going on inside religious communities, not necessarily that every underground church or church has to be directly under government control, but that there should be no surprises and that there should be some form of control. For example, this is a mosque in the Chinese western city of Dunhuang, where the famous Buddhist art caves are. You'll notice in the national flag right above the main entranceway. Later, I took this picture in 2019, in October of 2019. Later, the 4 minarets, you can see 2 on the left, or maybe even 3 on the left. Maybe there's 6 then, and there were 3 more then on the left side, which are obscured. They were taken down actually as being too dominant, as dominating the cityscape of Dunhuang. And so the minarets were taken down. The mosque's still open and functioning, according to friends of mine who live there, but they don't want to have as much dominant religious imagery. So the key is that the state, the Chinese state, should be dominant. I thought this was also just funny. This is a WeChat. I'm on a WeChat newsletter for a Taoist temple, and I mention this here because, and I machine translated this just so for people who are Chinese is not so great, just to take a look at it. It's the you can see it says the Maoshan Chenyuan Temple, and this was in June of this year, and they announced that the new Fourth Army, which was a communist army in the anti-Japanese war period, it was in the temple at one point. Now they're going to have to build sort of a memorial to the new Fourth Army inside the temple. And I just mention this because I think it's important to realize that Sinicization, it seems absurd. Why would you have Sinicization of Taoism, which is a Chinese religion, for goodness sakes, right? But so the key to understanding this term is that it doesn't really have to do with different architecture or liturgy or something like that, or practices. Rather, it has to do with creating patriotism and control, frankly. Here you have the nuns of the temple and another thing for the 100th anniversary of the party, and they're all sitting around a table looking at a giant screen and watching Xi Jinping give a speech. And so this is the kind of thing that has to go on. We tend to think of it going on more in just Christian and say Islam settings, but also for other religions as well. So the state is trying to burrow in and make sure that its message gets into all religious organizations. And this was sort of just a continuation of the WeChat post. Christianity, as I said, 2 tactics for Protestants and Catholics. I think for Protestantism, it's harder to control, I guess, from their perspective, because there is no potential hierarchical organization with which you can have negotiations. So there's been an effort to close down very large churches that have hundreds and hundreds of members. So the big active Protestant house churches that were almost like mega churches, right? They haven't all been demolished like this, but many of the churches, some of the big churches have been demolished or certainly shuttered. Some of these had enormous number of structures. They had kindergartens, they had seminaries, They had daycare for kids, and so on and so forth. And so that has been completely reined in. And of course, there's still going to be, for Protestantism, just as for Catholicism, underground churches. But I think that the government wants this to go back to probably what they think of as the original intent of allowing underground Christianity, which is that if it's really just a group of pious people meeting in a small group, let's say a dozen, 20 people, that's probably going to be okay. Stay apolitical. That's going to be allowed. But anything that gets too big would not be allowed. And then any maybe too overt signs of say Christianity or Islam are limited. As I said before, I mentioned Islam again because I get the example of the minarets, and here the cross is being taken off, even at some official churches. If you, however, are in the, say, officially recognized religious groups, I think it's still quite possible. There's not an effort, to eradicate all religious life. And people say it's just like the Cultural Revolution in China. That's not accurate. I think it's an effort by Xi Jinping to go back to the 1950s, when you had the 5 official religious groups. They were supposed to organize all religious life, and there wasn't really supposed to be anything else. And if there was something else, it might be tolerated, but only if it's small scale and not threatening to the party, as the party sees it as being as threatening or not. Not whether they actually threaten or not, but whether the party sees it as a threat. In other words, being too organized. So here, this is a pilgrimage in Shenxi, and this is an official Catholic church from Tianshui that went there on the pilgrimage, and these are very real, meaningful experiences for people, with a great amount of fellowship, and a great experience for people. These were all scenes from the pilgrimage that day. This was not some sort of a fake thing taken by the Xinhua news agency. This was a coincidence that I was there for, I don't know, a week or 10 days in the village and the surroundings, and there were many pilgrimages like this going on. So these weren't staged, in other words, to make it look like everyone's having a great time. I think they really were having a great time, a meaningful time. And obviously, if you play ball, then there will be sometimes new churches that are built, such as this church in Ningde in Fujian province. This is, of course, not coincidental that they're building a new church there, because this is a site of great underground Catholic activity. Many of you may be familiar with the situation there in that area. So the government's message, I think, is if you are in the official church, you can have new buildings and better infrastructure and stuff like that. If you, however, stay with the other side, this is the underground bishop who last October, Bishop Guo, who then resigned because he didn't want to get in the way of the accord between Beijing and the Vatican. Then there'll be more trouble, and so there'll be. I mean, they're not closing down all the underground churches by any means, and some of you may have a better sense of that than I do. But I think it's clear that they're trying to use incentives, carrots and sticks, to push people back into the official churches. That's his. This is there. What I wonder also, for example, and I don't know, this is just an open question. When you go around areas like this, there are many interesting shrines that don't fit the official narrative. This is a shrine in that area, Mindong, in the countryside, to a Catholic martyr who was killed in the Cultural Revolution. It's just on the edge of a village. It's a beautiful little area, open air, and clearly it's not a great advertisement for the party's treatment of religion. But as of a couple of years ago, when I was there, this was still very vibrant and lively, and people came and went. Just this is sort of a view from the shrine looking out onto the village, the fields below on the left, and then the village on the right. People would just come by to chat, pray a little bit, but it was a vibrant part of everyday life. And I wonder if how these things will fare in the future. It's more of an open question, because I think the extent of the party's push right now it's hard to come, for me at least, it's hard to come to a concrete conclusion exactly how it's going to play out, because it's a work in progress. The government is pushing very hard, but we have to also remember that leaders in China don't last forever. And although people tend to think that Xi Jinping will be in power forever, that's not the case, because he is actually mortal, and one day won't be there, and who knows when that will be. I mean, his term is supposed to end next year. That's almost certainly not going to happen. But how many years after that he carries on, it's hard to say. So he is obviously a forceful character pushing for control, but how much China is a big place, and shrines like this exist and are hard. It's hard for the government to get control over everything. So sometimes we tend to, especially when we see things from afar, we tend to think, gosh, the government holds all the cards. It has absolute control over everything. It's got a strong authoritarian leader, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you get on the ground, you realize that it's not that simplistic. And so it's hard to make absolute, for me at least, it's hard to make absolute judgment calls on where this will all lead. I think the implications, though, if you want to speak very broadly, are that for especially Islam, the situation is going to be very difficult, because this is not just one policy to gain control over potentially troublesome NGO, civil society type organizations, which is how the government might view religious groups, but it's a cultural issue where Han Chinese have difficulty in accepting the multiculturalism of their country. I think not all Han Chinese, obviously, but some Han Chinese. And in the government, the idea that, yeah, there are these areas out west, especially, where there are predominant Muslim populations, but we have to keep a super tight lid on that. And we know all about the situation, I think, in Xinjiang. That's the most dramatic example of it. But even in other parts of China where there are large Muslim populations, there are all kinds of signs of the government wanting to push a Han Chinese assimilative policy on these groups. So it goes beyond religious, and it goes more to cultural nationalism or nativism. And so I think for Islam is a very special case in this regard, because these are different ethnic groups, and Christianity is not the same, because Christianity, you're dealing with Han Chinese, and there the issue is more political and social control and how these groups negotiate control. This is a picture of the camps in Xinjiang. I think what you're going to find, whether it's in any religion, and I just leave sort of this image, is increased government control and government visibility in the religious sphere. This is a flag-raising ceremony at a Buddhist temple. I think it's Shaolin Temple, one of the most famous. And then to go back to my opening picture, why did I take this picture? I did clamber up on the rocks. Behind the statue is actually a closed circuit television camera and taking video of everybody who's going into the shrine. So it's kind of I don't want to make it, into this scary Orwellian situation, but it's clearly the government. You think you're in a cave, you're in a quiet space where you're able to commune directly with God, but the state may well know what you're up to. So at least that's the goal of the state, whether how things actually play out on the ground in China, is always much more ambiguous and hard to control. But with that, I think I'll stop the lecturing part of my talk, and I'm happy to open it up for questions and answers.
I'm Daniel Lindbergh Lang, and I have a degree in journalism, and I'm Chinese American Catholic, and really wanted to ask what advice you have for an aspiring writer. I'm reading your Souls of China book, I think, 2017 right now, and it's so inspiring and also harrowing. Very curious how to learn to do work like that in a considerate and productive way that helps a lot of people.
Well, yeah, I think the key, I mean, it's hard to say, but I think obviously if you want to, journalism, my first advice to all aspiring journalists is journalism is kind of like carpentry. It's something you mainly learn by doing. And so you can get a degree in journalism, and many people do, and with credential inflation in the world, people get all kinds of degrees and every sort of thing. But the real thing about journalism is to do it, to write under the supervision of an experienced editor or mentor, so you can get good feedback. So you can learn, it's just like maybe like carpentry, you can learn some of the theories, you need to know some geometry and so on and so forth, but you actually have to do the 10,000 hour rule of just doing and doing and doing. And then the more you write, the better you get at it. But you need feedback, you need good feedback. And then I think for interviewing people, the thing that modern society doesn't allow very much of is time. The more time you can spend with people, the better. So being as immersive as possible. Right now, there's always the pressure to do quick hits, to do something short and quick and get a tweet out on it and that sort of thing. But if you really want to get to know people, you have to gain their trust, and you can only gain trust with time and so I think that's something that I would emphasize.
I'm Sister Maria Gabriel Stanfield. I'm a member of a Franciscan community that was started in China. I'm here with a couple of my sisters. I have just a basic question because a lot of this is new to me. What are the 5 established religions in China?
Oh, yeah. Well, sorry about that. I should have mentioned that. So the 5 established religions are Buddhism, Taoism or Taoism, Islam, and then for administrative purposes, Christianity is considered to be two religions, Protestantism and Catholicism. So there's really 4 religions, but say 5 religious organizations. And so in theory, everything else in China is illegal. Judaism, Hinduism, you cannot start a Jewish temple or a Hindu temple or anything like that, right? So it's, in fact, if you're just a business person, say coming from a foreign country and you're Jewish or Hindu, they don't care. But you can't proselytize and you can't operate like that. So anything like that is illegal, and there's only those 5 groups. This goes back about 100 years. Even under the Republic of China era, they tried to organize religious life and define which are the religious groups, what are acceptable religious groups and what are not. And maybe most noticeably absent from those 5 groups is Confucianism, which many people consider to be or has very strong religious elements. There are temples, Confucius temples around China, but it was maybe too much associated with the old imperial order and was never accepted as a religion after the empire collapsed in 1911, and now is widely seen, more as a philosophy or cultural practice.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for a wonderful talk. My question has to do with this attitude of seclusion or closed-mindedness on the part of the government. I don't know if there is some kind of like a complex, because I'm thinking, depending on how you look at history, there are a lot of reasons for China to want to sinicize, to promote our traditional religious heritage to the disadvantage and suppression of foreign elements. But also, at the same time, we're seeing that a lot of children of these government officials are being sent overseas to get an education. And we also lose a lot of talents, some of our brightest minds. go abroad and do not come back, and they try to get these talents back. So these matters, I mean, have to be pretty obvious to the government leaders. So if you're going to like analyze the psychologically, why would they prevent foreign elements to grow in China, but at the same time send their children to be educated by Westerners?
Well, that's a good question. I think that there's been a huge boom in the number of Chinese students, as you say, that have gone overseas to study, including children of senior leaders. And I think this is simply because people want the best education possible. So education, culturally in China is so important, and there's just this belief that especially the United States has sort of the best university system in the world, and that people therefore want to send their children there. So it's, I think it's primarily that motivation. The children of very senior leaders, I don't think, are going abroad as much as before. Xi Jinping's daughter went to the United States, but she came back, of course, after he ascended to the top. And I think this is viewed a little more, I don't want to say suspiciously, for the senior cast of leaders. But yeah, I think it's hard to prevent that from happening because people do value education so strongly.
Thank you for a great talk and that overview. You're showing a lot of pictures of people, and when you're interviewing people, whether in house churches or elsewhere, in terms of how you think about the future or the present, what do you think about your obligations, or how do you navigate showing pictures, sort of outing people in public? I think especially in house churches, but do you see risks for people in that, for children in that, for families? Do you just sort of, do you otherwise anonymize people? How do you?
Well, these pictures, I mean, I'm just showing to you all. I'm not publishing these pictures. When I interview people, I always get their permission. So that's a ethical obligation that one has as a journalist. You have to sometimes even educate people about the risks. I've had many people who are maybe people in the countryside who don't really know how the media works, or they're not that well educated. They'll say, of course you can print my name, and you can even print a picture of my ID card and tell Xi Jinping that he's a scoundrel or something like that. And you're like, maybe that isn't such a great idea if I do that. And then tell them, well, there are risks if you speak to foreign media. And so if I think that the person isn't aware of the risks, then I will ask them if they're okay if I just don't use their name or something like that. US media is not allowed to anonymize. Well, we can anonymize people at their request, of course, but we can't change their names. So that would be considered unethical if you gave somebody the wrong name. So I think you just have to get their permission or not when you're talking to them. And sometimes, as I say, you have to bend over backwards to make sure they understand the potential risks. So that's basically how we deal with that. Yeah, if anybody has questions, feel free to send me an email. You can find my contact number on my website, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.